Not only through his own Cherokee ancestry discovered his own Jewish roots, but he's also leading the charge in the DNA discoveries of the ancient roots of the Cherokee and other Native American communities.
In recent years, a set of Cherokee DNA results surfaced that no one was supposed to see.
The light that the right is taking in the Cherokee Nation, saying this is not right, you shouldn't have done this, is about tribal affiliation. It's nothing to do with the blood test.
The data looked ordinary at first, but when scientists traced the markers, they uncovered something that defied every accepted theory of American origins.
And the first words of it is, when we came from beyond the great waters. And it was the story of the Cherokee migration across the Pacific Ocean.
What they found in Cherokee bloodlines did not just rewrite history, it threatened to expose something the nation itself was built to forget.
Company DNA Consultants has also shown evidence of Cherokee having DNA ties to the ancient Phoenician and Minoan sea peoples.
The discovery was real, the records were sealed, and what remains is America's darkest secret. The myth America was built on. In the early 19th century, the American government and its academic institutions created a version of prehistory that would serve their political goals. They needed a story that placed indigenous people as recent arrivals rather than ancient civilizations. This story began to take shape through anthropology, a young science that depended heavily on government funding. By the mid-1800s, prominent American scholars began promoting the idea that all native peoples came from a small group of hunters who crossed a frozen land bridge between Siberia and Alaska about 15,000 years ago. This land bridge theory was presented as scientific fact even though it was based on very limited evidence. It explained the presence of Native Americans in a way that fit neatly into the belief that the Americas were once empty lands waiting for progress to arrive. The theory grew in popularity because it aligned perfectly with the politics of the time.
Another Cherokee Nation member is accusing Warren of playing politics.
During the era of manifest destiny, American leaders claimed that the nation had a divine right to expand across the continent. The land bridge theory supported this by suggesting that Native Americans were not the first people to inhabit the land, but rather migrants themselves. If they had once traveled from another continent, then European settlers could be seen as doing the same. The difference, according to this logic, was that Europeans brought civilization, while the native peoples had remained primitive. This idea turned conquest into rediscovery. The Smithsonian Institution, founded in 1846, became one of the most powerful voices promoting this narrative.
Is what I would call the building of a whole new world.
Many of its early directors and field researchers were tied to government agencies that oversaw expansion into native territories. Their archaeological work was not just about science, it was also a political project. Excavations across the Midwest were often interpreted to fit the new theory, rather than test it, ensuring that native peoples were portrayed as late arrivals. Reports often concluded that a lost race had built these structures and that modern Native Americans had replaced them later. This interpretation served two purposes. It denied indigenous people a deep connection to the land and justified removing them from it. Some scholars and field observers challenged this view. They noticed that mound-building practices, pottery styles, and oral histories linked living tribes like the Cherokee and Creek directly to those ancient sites.
And what's been incredibly eye-opening are the countless Cherokee alive today discovering Sephardic Jewish ancestry, including yourself. Explain that.
Their findings suggested that these civilizations had developed locally over thousands of years. However, their voices were quickly marginalized. Academic journals refused to publish work that contradicted the official line. Researchers who persisted were accused of poor methodology or even fraud. Funding was withdrawn, and their field notes were often left unpublished. The result was an academic silence that lasted generations. By the early 20th century, the land bridge theory had moved from hypothesis to dogma. Textbooks in public schools described it as proven truth. Children learned that Native Americans were nomadic hunters who had wandered into a new continent and slowly formed small tribes. This version of history stripped away any recognition of large, complex societies that might have existed before European arrival. It also concealed evidence of advanced agriculture, trade networks, and linguistic diversity that pointed to a much older and richer past. The myth turned an entire continent's history into a single migration story. For the Cherokee, this imposed narrative erased their deeper origins. Their language, ceremonies, and architectural traditions pointed to a cultural development far older than 15,000 years, yet they were categorized within the same framework as every other tribe. The official timeline left no room for their own records, which spoke of ancestors who came from the East, long before written history. By the middle of the 20th century, American identity and native history had been reshaped by a convenient lie. The land bridge story gave the United States a moral cover for its expansion, while pushing indigenous civilizations into the shadows of prehistory. But while this theory shaped the nation's self-image, new discoveries in the Appalachian soil and long-ignored Cherokee oral traditions began to surface. What they revealed did not fit the official narrative, and no historian could fully explain it. The ancestors who shouldn't be here. When European settlers and explorers began moving into the Appalachian region between the late 1600s and early 1800s, they found remains that did not match any known native culture. These early arrivals included English, Scottish, and Irish frontiersmen who traveled west from Virginia and the Carolinas into Cherokee lands. Some were traders and surveyors who recorded strange features in their journals. They described stone walls and fortifications buried under heavy forest growth. These structures followed patterns unfamiliar to them, and unlike the wooden stockades used by local tribes. The masonry was tight, and the stones were fitted without mortar, resembling construction found around the Mediterranean. Later, farmers who cleared land in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee reported uncovering large burial mounds filled with ornaments made of copper and bronze. These metals were not typical of local native use. The Cherokee and other southeastern tribes worked with copper in simple forms, but did not smelt or alloy it. When the items were analyzed, they showed traces of tin, which meant they were bronze. Bronze requires smelting, a complex process that combines copper and tin at high heat, and this technology was unknown to indigenous groups in the area before European contact. By the early 1700s, missionaries and travelers recorded these same mysteries. Moravian missionaries working in Cherokee towns near present-day Georgia and North Carolina wrote about ancient mounds and fort-like stone enclosures whose origins no one could explain. They asked Cherokee elders about these sites and were told stories that did not match the settlers' expectations. According to several accounts, the Cherokee spoke of ancient visitors who came from the sunrise. These visitors were described as light-skinned people who arrived in large boats long before the arrival of Europeans. They carried metal tools and ornaments, unlike anything the Cherokee had seen. Some accounts said the visitors stayed and intermarried with local people. The elders explained that the Cherokee were the native people of this land, but their ancestors had once met these foreigners from across the Eastern Ocean. The Sunrise People, as they were called, were not Cherokee, yet their presence had become part of Cherokee memory. The elders said that some of their knowledge of metal and stone came from this ancient contact, and that traces of these visitors survived in stories and possibly in bloodlines. Archaeological findings from the 1800s supported parts of these oral traditions. In Tennessee, North Carolina, and northern Georgia, early excavations revealed tools and ornaments that did not match native craftsmanship. Many bore geometric engravings and spiral motifs, similar to Mediterranean design. Some artifacts contained copper mixed with arsenic, a metal combination known in ancient North Africa, but not in the pre-Columbian Americas. When professional archaeologists began cataloging these items, the results caused discomfort. To prevent controversy, some of the finds were reclassified as trade items obtained after European contact. This explanation failed to fit the physical evidence, since many artifacts were found deep in undisturbed burial layers that predated European settlement. In 1848, archaeologists Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis published a detailed report of mound excavations across the Midwest and Appalachia. Their findings included skulls with narrow faces and high nasal bridges, features that differed from typical regional remains. These physical differences suggested diverse ancestry, meaning the ancient population might have included people of mixed or foreign origins, rather than a single local lineage of indigenous Appalachian peoples, such as the ancestral Cherokee. But such claims were rejected by academic authorities. Government-backed curators discouraged any mention of Old World traits in native burials. As a result, many reports were altered or published without the controversial details. Squire and Davis continued their work, but their observations were quietly dismissed by official institutions that wanted to avoid any suggestion of transatlantic contact. Linguistic studies also pointed to unusual connections. 19th-century linguists comparing Cherokee with ancient Semitic and Berber languages found similarities in basic root words and grammatical structures, particularly in terms related to sky, family, and earth. These resemblances were surprising but were quickly dismissed by academic reviewers as coincidence. Within a few decades, funding for comparative linguistic work of this kind ended entirely, leaving the question unresolved. All these findings, metal artifacts, stone constructions, skeletal variations, and linguistic parallels, suggested a much older and more complex history than anyone had been taught. They implied that the Cherokee region may once have been part of a network that stretched across oceans. The idea was politically dangerous, and by the end of the 19th century, most discussion of it had disappeared from official research. Yet the Cherokee oral stories of people from the sunrise remained. The legends might have been dismissed as myth, but modern science would soon uncover proof of those ancient visitors hidden not in the ground, but within the blood of the Cherokee people. The DNA that shouldn't exist. In the 1990s, scientists began testing the DNA of Cherokee descendants to better understand their ancestral origins.
To be Native American ancestry through DNA testing. We first broke that story for you at 5, and it has taken off online.
The studies were carried out by a mix of universities, independent research groups, and private genealogy projects. The goal seemed straightforward. Based on long-accepted migration models, the results were expected to show the 4 maternal haplogroups traditionally associated with all Native Americans, A, B, C, and D. These lineages, passed down through the mother's side, were believed to trace back to a small group of people who crossed from Siberia into Alaska roughly 15,000 years ago. Every textbook and anthropology course described this as settled fact. When the results came back, however, they were nothing like what researchers had prepared for. Alongside the expected native haplogroups, the Cherokee samples contained other lineages that did not fit the established pattern. A number of participants showed haplogroups T, U, J, H, and X. These genetic signatures were not Siberian. They were most commonly found in populations from the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, and the Middle East. Haplogroup X drew the most attention because it was so unexpected. This particular lineage had previously been identified in Europe and parts of the Near East, but it was thought to be almost non-existent among Native Americans. Yet in Cherokee DNA, it appeared with remarkable frequency. The implications were enormous. If haplogroups tied to ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern peoples existed in Cherokee maternal lines, then the long-held theory that all native ancestry came exclusively from Asia was incomplete. The findings implied that there had been some kind of contact between Old World and New World populations thousands of years before Columbus. This was not just a minor adjustment to a migration map. It directly challenged the foundation of American anthropology. When the first data appeared on early internet genetic forums and small academic reports, it caused quiet but intense debate. Some researchers tried to suggest contamination, meaning that the samples had been accidentally mixed with European DNA through recent intermarriage. However, deeper genetic sequencing showed that the unusual haplogroups were ancient, not modern. The patterns were too old and too consistent across separate Cherokee families to be the result of recent European influence. As discussion grew, several of the studies were suddenly withdrawn. Some laboratories issued brief statements citing methodological inconsistencies or incomplete data sets. Behind the scenes, researchers later described institutional pressure to retract or revise their findings. Certain anthropology departments warned that publishing results suggesting Old World ancestry in Native Americans could create political confusion and damage professional credibility. One independent geneticist reported that some of his Cherokee DNA samples showed closer genetic distance to Middle Eastern populations than to East Asian or Siberian ones. The statistical evidence, he said, was clear, but journals repeatedly declined to publish his analysis. The academic response became increasingly cautious. Geneticists who worked with Native communities feared backlash for appearing to question indigenous identity or for contradicting accepted migration timelines. The situation was sensitive because Native identity had long been tied to scientific definitions established by outsiders. Admitting that Old World haplogroups existed among Cherokee people would mean rewriting the biological framework used to define who counted as Native in both anthropology and government policy. For now, the conflict remained confined to academic circles and professional reputations. The larger political reasons for why this discovery mattered would only emerge years later. By 2003, funding for large-scale Native American DNA research began to dry up. Projects that once sought to map regional diversity were quietly canceled or merged into broader population studies that no longer highlighted individual tribes. The official reason was budget limitation, but many involved in the work believed that the real cause was the growing unease surrounding the Cherokee findings. Despite the suppression, the data had already circulated among independent researchers and genetic hobbyists who continued to discuss the discovery that threatened to overturn the most basic assumptions about who the first Americans really were. The the scientific data raised one unavoidable question. If these haplogroups were genuine, what ancient bloodlines carried them into the mountains of Appalachia? The search for that answer would move beyond laboratories and into the private histories of families whose ancestry held the key to a forgotten world. The forbidden bloodline. For centuries, many Cherokee families quietly preserved family histories that spoke of mixed ancestry long before DNA testing existed.
To talk now about her ancestry or DNA analysis, we think muddies the waters a bit.
These stories passed down through generations included accounts of marriages between Cherokee ancestors and outsiders who did not fit the descriptions of later European settlers. Some claimed descent from visitors who came across the Eastern Ocean in ancient times. Others recorded that their families included Jewish, North African, or Mediterranean roots. In isolated communities across the Appalachians, these oral records survived in family Bibles, handwritten notes, and spoken testimony, even as official history denied that such unions had ever taken place. One of the most publicized examples of this mixed lineage appeared generations later in the family of Elvis Presley. His maternal line traced back to a woman known as White Dove, remembered in genealogies as a full-blood Cherokee who married a man of Jewish descent. Presley's mother, Gladys, spoke proudly of both identities. In family tradition, their heritage was not divided between Native and Old World, but understood as a single inheritance. Presley wore a Jewish symbol, the chai, throughout his life, and had a Star of David placed on his mother's grave to honor that ancestry. For many families like his, mixed heritage was not an anomaly, but an accepted truth. Historical records from the 17th and 18th centuries confirm that traders, missionaries, and settlers frequently intermarried with Cherokee women, particularly those from priestly or elite clans. These unions often produced children who were raised within Cherokee society and maintained both sides of their heritage. Later genetic testing would reveal that some of these lineages carried haplogroups J and U, which are most common among Jewish and North African populations. This meant that the presence of Old World DNA among Cherokee descendants was not simply a result of recent European mixing, but may have represented far older contact and intermarriage that predated the colonial period. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, however, the U.S. government began to standardize Native identity through legal classifications. The Bureau of Indian Affairs created strict racial categories for enrollment on tribal rolls. Genealogy offices began what were called correction programs, which aimed to tidy records that contained inconsistencies. Families whose ancestry showed non-standard lineages such as Mediterranean or African traces were often reclassified as white, mixed non-Indian, or simply removed from tribal records. The policy was presented as administrative efficiency, but in practice it erased complex bloodlines that did not fit government definitions of race or identity. This system reached its most formal expression in the Dawes Rolls, which determined who could be legally recognized as Native American. Enrollment officers frequently altered applications to match racial expectations. People with Old World surnames, foreign ancestry claims, or physical traits that did not fit government descriptions were denied recognition. Tribal membership became tied to measurable blood quantum and to the approved haplogroups that scientists had declared native. Officials said these corrections were needed to preserve consistency in records, but in practice, they reinforced existing racial hierarchies and the migration model accepted by federal agencies at the time. By the early 20th century, thousands of Cherokee individuals and families had lost legal recognition. Their mixed heritage was written out of public record, and their descendants inherited stories that no longer appeared in official archives. These families kept their identities alive in private, but their names were missing from the very documents that defined who counted as Cherokee. As these families lost their legal identities, the larger Cherokee nation faced something far worse: the painful destruction of both their people and the physical evidence of their origins. The Trail of Erasure. By the 19th century, the Cherokee had become one of the most documented and targeted indigenous nations in the United States. They lived on fertile farmland in the Appalachian region, an area that drew growing numbers of European American settlers, farmers, miners, and land speculators moving westward from states like Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. These settlers often came across ancient earthworks, burial mounds, and stone structures scattered across Cherokee territory. To them, these sites were not sacred or historical evidence of a deep indigenous past. They were treated as curiosities, meaning strange relics to be collected, disturbed, or displayed, rather than preserved or respected. Many settlers dug into the mounds out of fascination or for personal gain, taking ornaments and pottery as souvenirs or selling them to museums and private collectors. As expansion intensified, the government's interest in this land was not limited to agriculture or gold. The Cherokee homeland contained the last standing evidence of a past that did not fit the national narrative. What followed was not only displacement, but the heart-wrenching destruction of physical proof that the Cherokee and their ancestors had lived in the region for thousands of years. The campaign began with scientific collection. Throughout the 1800s, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology organized teams to excavate Cherokee burial grounds and mounds in Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Officials claimed that the goal was to study the prehistory of America. In practice, these excavations removed thousands of artifacts and human remains from their resting places. Many were stored without proper identification or context, which made it impossible to link them back to the Cherokee people. Early museum reports classified the finds as belonging to prehistoric or unknown cultures, separating them from living native nations. This labeling allowed researchers to claim that the Cherokee were later arrivals who had taken over lands once held by others. When news of the excavations reached Cherokee communities, the reaction was one of deep grief and anger. Elders and families spoke of ancestors being disturbed and sacred sites being torn apart. Women who tended burial areas wept when they saw outsiders carrying away bones and ceremonial objects. Some Cherokee tried to block access or petition local authorities to stop the digging, but their protests were ignored. The removal of their dead was seen as the ultimate humiliation, a sign that the government no longer recognized their humanity or their connection to the land. As the number of excavations grew, so did the demand for land. In the early 1830s, gold was discovered in northern Georgia near Cherokee territory. Settlers flooded into the region, and pressure mounted for the government to remove the Cherokee altogether. At the time, the United States was expanding rapidly under the policy known as Manifest Destiny, the belief that white Americans were divinely ordained to settle the continent from coast to coast. This ideology treated indigenous nations as obstacles to national growth. The U.S. government held military power, controlled federal courts, and had the support of state governments eager for land and mineral wealth. President Andrew Jackson, a former general with a long record of fighting native nations, supported this expansionist vision. He endorsed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced relocation of native peoples living east of the Mississippi River to newly designated Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. The Cherokee resisted through legal means. Their leaders, including Chief John Ross, appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court in a series of cases that affirmed their sovereignty and territorial rights. The ruling in Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, declared that the state of Georgia had no authority over Cherokee lands. Jackson and state officials ignored the decision, knowing that federal power, public opinion, and economic interest were on their side. By 1838, the U.S. Army was sent to enforce removal. Thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children were rounded up into camps and marched west under military escort. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears. Disease, starvation, and exposure claimed thousands of lives. Families were separated, and entire communities disappeared along the route. While the official purpose of removal was to open land for white settlers, the result also accomplished something less visible but equally lasting. It severed the Cherokee from their sacred sites, burial grounds, and archaeological records. Mounds were flattened for farmland or destroyed during construction. Towns built on top of old ceremonial centers erased what little remained of their history in the region. After the relocation, the Bureau of Ethnology continued to collect materials from abandoned Cherokee areas. Items recovered from mound sites were shipped to Washington, where many were placed in storage or reclassified as Mississippian culture artifacts. The term referred to an ancient mound-building tradition, but was used so broadly that it separated those remains from any direct connection to the Cherokee. In effect, the evidence of their continuity in the Southeast was rewritten to fit a new historical framework that portrayed the Cherokee as late migrants. By the end of the 19th century, the Cherokee had survived the physical journey but lost much of their material connection to their origins. Their lands were settled, their remains cataloged, and their history rewritten. The removal was complete in both body and evidence. Yet the story did not end there. The Genome Directive. By the early 2000s, a new kind of control began to replace the physical suppression of the past. Instead of removing people from their land or erasing their artifacts, modern institutions turned to data. The rise of biotechnology made DNA the most valuable form of evidence about human history. Governments, universities, and private companies began collecting genetic material from Native American groups, including the Cherokee, through programs advertised as medical research. Participants were told that their DNA would help identify hereditary diseases. In reality, the same material was being cross-referenced in federal and academic studies of human migration. This shift marked the beginning of what researchers quietly called the genome directive. It was not an official law, but an internal practice that determined who had access to genetic data. Rather than curiosity or open discovery, the goal became containment. Certain results, especially those that pointed to Old World ancestry or contradicted the Asian land bridge theory, were treated as sensitive information. Requests for access were routinely denied, and the data was withheld from public genomic databases. Commercial DNA testing companies also became part of this system. They shared anonymized user data with research partners, including government agencies and universities. Native American samples, especially those marked as Cherokee, appeared in several migration-related studies that were never publicly released. When advocates demanded transparency, institutions cited heritage security restrictions, a classification term borrowed from national defense programs. It implied that the data might have implications beyond science, possibly touching legal or territorial issues linked to ancient ancestry. The new form of control required no excavation, censorship, or destruction. It operated quietly within digital archives and secure databases. The power lay not in silencing voices, but in limiting who could access the information that defined them. Genetic data that once could have rewritten history was now sealed, owned, and regulated by a handful of organizations. Yet even this technological barrier could not hide the reason behind it. To uncover that, one must understand what the American state feared most. America's darkest secret. What made the Cherokee DNA so dangerous was not what it proved about the past, but what it threatened in the present. The discovery risked pulling apart the story that keeps America politically and legally intact. The nation's identity rests on a single assumption, that civilization arrived here from Europe. Every monument, schoolbook, and treaty traces back to that idea. Without it, the chain of ownership that defines land, law, and legitimacy begins to break. Inside government circles, this understanding is not theoretical. Legal scholars have long warned that if ancient transatlantic contact were ever recognized as historical fact, the foundation of federal land titles and native treaties could be challenged. If Old World peoples reach the continent and their blood survives within indigenous nations, then the United States occupies territory that once belonged to an already international civilization. That recognition would open demands for restitution beyond anything modern courts could manage. For policymakers, silence is not about protecting history. It is about preventing collapse. The records stay sealed because acknowledging them would unravel more than narratives. It would expose that America's sovereignty itself was built on a false starting point. Acknowledgement would mean admitting that the Republic was not born from discovery, but from succession, taking the place of something older and erased. In this light, the management of Cherokee DNA is not scientific caution but political containment. It ensures that the evidence remains fragmented, that no single institution holds the full genetic picture, the legal order of property, and the moral claim of discovery. To release the truth would invite a rewriting of world history in which America is not the beginning of a new world, but the continuation of an old one it tried to forget. This is America's darkest secret. It is not the loss of evidence, but the maintenance of power through controlled truth. The Cherokee bloodlines are more than heritage. They are a living record that still contradicts the nation's birth certificate. As long as they exist, the past America buried remains alive inside its own body. What do you think about the Cherokee DNA mystery? Comment down below.